Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Following up on that, I'm very concerned about the lack of response to the United Nations. Over the weekend, the U.S. did impose sanctions on Iran again on their ballistic missile program, and I am encouraged, but I am very concerned, as the Chairman just alluded, about the lack of response, and I'd like to talk about that. Also, we see continued testing in North Korea. We've had evidence in the past that Iran participates with Korea as observers or whatever. It looks to me like that we have one country testing, a rogue country, North Korea, testing, possibly for two countries. Having said that, I am very concerned that we get after the people involved in that, and that is the sanctions. Instead of going after individuals and these shell companies, my suggestion was, and we put a letter to the President last week, I think 14 senators signed it, that encouraged the administration to go after the foreign banks that are actually financing these ballistic missile tests and the program, instead of these shell companies and individuals. We all know how people can maneuver around those with paperwork. We saw that in the sanctions on the Russian individuals just in the last year or two. My question is what do you suggest we actually do to impact their ballistic missile program now that the coalition is absolutely gone? I agree with the Chairman. This is a practical matter as far as I'm concerned. And I'd like to get your thoughts about what the administration should be doing now, what we should be thinking about as a Senate to basically enforce the sanctions and the position we already have taken. Mr. Singh, would you start that?
Sure thing. Well, Senator, I agree with your concern, and I agree with your concern about the lack of UN Security Council response. And just one thing I would point out, maybe to add to your concern, Senator, is that so much of what we're talking about when we talk about even the enforcement of the JCPOA, much less things that aren't in the JCPOA, like the missile question, depend on this joint commission, where we have to have 5 out of the 8 members of the joint commission on our side. Well, in the coming year or two, we're going to have elections in France and Germany and elsewhere. The EU is obviously not an elected body. I don't think we can be 100% sure that we'll have all those folks on our side as they're pursuing business with Iran and so forth. And so I think we will need to be taking a lot of this leadership ourselves, unfortunately. It should have been in the nuclear deal. There's no doubt about that. Missiles are part of a nuclear program, and we've seen that with North Korea. And I think to simply wave them away and treat them as a sort of separate matter is the beginning of our problem here. And so now we're left with the question of, well, what do we do as a rearguard action to stop this? I think it will need to be stronger sanctions. I think it can't just be designations, but it'll need to be sanctions which are felt more strongly in Iran and, as you said, by those outside of Iran who are abetting the actions that Iran is taking. I think it'll need to be interdictions and export controls. One thing to bear in mind about Implementation Day is Implementation Day means that Iran has been certified by the IAEA as having done its initial obligations. That doesn't mean that other countries, say in Asia and elsewhere, are themselves ready to implement those export controls, the procurement channel that's talked about in the JCPOA or in Resolution 2231. And so part of this has to be to work with those countries to ensure that they have the controls in place, they have a strong presumption of denial, and they also have a worry about the penalties they'll incur if they fail to implement that. Then I think there also has to be a ballistic missile defense component to this. I think if Iran is going to be taking provocative missile tests, I think it's very important that we show, as an alliance there in the Middle East, that we are well prepared to deal with that Iranian missile threat, to deter that Iranian missile threat by having a strong theater-wide BMD capability, and that requires investment from the United States. It requires getting our allies together in a complementary fashion to do that in the region.
If I could add to it, because I think Mike offered a very cogent list of moves that we can do on the sanctions front and then also on the defense with the ballistic missile defense. But as I was saying before, our footprint, our military presence in the region is quite robust. There are things that we could do in terms of actions with partners in the region, whether it's exercises or similar responses, which we've not seen in recent years. We've seen before. We've seen in terms of multilateral naval exercises in the Gulf, where we bring a number of these countries, and the Senator Corker mentioned that we have no coalition left. The best way to reinforce a coalition or rebuild it is not only through these actions and sanctions and things that restrict their ability, but then also things that we can do in terms of calculated, very measured actions that send a signal to the Iranian regime that you've done this, we're going to sanction you, but we're also going to put on full display what our capabilities are. And if you do this again, you're going to see on full display what we can do with our partners in the region. And again, I'm not advocating war or anything like this, but the sort of signaling, the sort of games that Iran plays, as we saw with their photographs of our soldiers who went off course there. These sorts of things, I think we should be more inclined to look to in terms of responses, as opposed to just, I share your concern about the lack of action at the UN. Well, guess what? It shouldn't surprise folks that the UN sometimes doesn't do enough in terms of what it should do and its responsibilities. But my main point is that there are things that the U.S. can do as the unrivaled leader in the Middle East with partners that can send messages to Iran and taking actions through naval exercises, through different exercises in response to these provocative measures, I think would be a very good thing.
So my last question, and this is a broad question, but I appreciate you both have spoken about this in your testimony before today and actually alluded to this today. I mean, how close are we to the actual ultimate fear that most of us have, that we're going to drift into an ultimate Sunni-Shia war in the region? Iran, Saudis, you've got Egypt sitting there, and then our intransigence really in Syria with Bashar al-Assad and Russia, given that we've created a second power vacuum in the region that Russia has now stepped into. To put on top of that the $100+ billion of cash that Iran looks like they're going to have access to here in the near future. And we know that there are past activities relating to support of Hezbollah, Hamas, Houthis, and so forth. Are we really drifting in that direction, or are we actually racing in that direction with our own intransigence? I'd like you both to respond to that quickly if you could.
Senator, to a certain extent, we're already there if you look at the conflicts in Syria and in Yemen. I would hesitate as an analyst to simply classify it as just Shia-Sunni. I understand that paradigm, and I think it's relevant. I'm not dismissing it completely. But essentially, this is about power between different nation states and the leaders of those nation states, Iran, Saudi Arabia, but then there's other layers of complexities. If you look a little bit westward to Libya, you see also a government that is fractured under the weight of regional competition, not between Iran and Saudi Arabia, but between different parts of the Gulf Cooperation Council countries and Egypt and their different view on political Islam. So there are layers of complexity here. But to a certain extent, we passed that point maybe several years ago. What I would say is that the U.S. is not responsible, though, for this vacuum primarily. I think our posture could have led to a different outcome, will lead to a different outcome if we have a much more assertive posture. But the primary responsibility for this breakdown of the state system in certain parts of the region, I think, rests in the hands of the leaders of the region. Iran, as we've discussed here extensively, is a key part of the problem. I would also argue that many of the other Gulf allies, out of fear, out of concerns about Iran, out of other motivations, have also contributed to the problem. But a much more coherent and, I think, robust presentation of U.S. aims towards the long term in the Middle East, I think, won't solve all of these problems, but could actually lead to a much more practical conflict resolution and a reinstitution of the state system that isn't simply just on the shoulders of authoritarianism and the sorts of values that are run contrary to our system. That may seem too ideal, but I actually think part of that is the quiet discussion we need to have with countries like Saudi Arabia, like Qatar, like all of the members of the Gulf Cooperation Council.
I agree with what Brian said. I wouldn't call it a Sunni-Shia conflict, and the reason is that some of our Sunni allies are almost as concerned about Sunni jihadism as they are about Iran. Iran, for its part, is quite happy to support some Sunni extremist organizations like Hamas. They've supported the Taliban in the past. And so sometimes the sectarian affiliation is a convenient way to extend influence, but I think it's not the only way, and I think that you see that really what we're engaged in here is this is a battle amongst states and blocks of states for preeminence in the region. And I think what you've seen is a breakdown of the regional security order, and you've seen a breakdown of states, as Brian has said. And that has caused this spreading chaos, and I expect it'll spread more unless something concerted is done to stem that. And I think we have a big role there. We have a big role in reconstituting a regional security order.
What should that role be?
I think we need to be in the lead. In the lead doesn't mean we have to do it. Doesn't mean we have to take the burden on ourselves. But I think we have to be the organizing force. We have to be the one that convenes our allies, brings them together, helps set the agenda, and again, also helps them with building their institutions. Because I think that the states who have done best, who have fared best throughout all this, are those that have resilient institutions. And I would like to see us invest not only in trying to solve what's happening in Syria and sort of help build governments in Libya. That's very hard. That's going to take a long time. even in the best of circumstances. But let's also make sure we're investing in shoring up the institutions in allied states that haven't yet succumbed to this chaos, because I think that's going to be quite important for them. They have to be responsive institutions to their people as well. That we can't lose that as part of our policy just because of the problems that we face.
Thank you both. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Well, once again, thank